Welcome to a journey through shadow and firelight, where we will walk gently through one of history's darkest chapters, not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand how ordinary fear can transform into extraordinary cruelty. Tonight, we step into a candlelit world where the boundaries between medicine and magic, wisdom and witchcraft, healer and heretic, were far less clear than they might seem from our modern perspective. Before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you for joining, and I hope your thoughts start to slow and you start to rest. Also, comment down below what time it is where you live. Now let's get started. Picture a village at twilight in the year 1580, somewhere in the heart of Europe. The last light fades from the western sky, and families retreat into their homes as darkness settles across thatched roofs and narrow lanes. Candles flicker to life in small windows, creating pools of warm light that push back against the encroaching night. In one cottage, an elderly woman tends her herbs, bundles of plants hanging from ceiling beams to dry. She knows which leaves ease fever, which roots calm upset stomachs, which flowers can draw infection from wounds. Her knowledge comes from her mother, and her mother's mother before that, an unbroken chain of women's wisdom stretching back beyond memory. At the village well, neighbours exchange whispered gossip about a recent illness, a cow that stopped giving milk, a marriage that seems troubled. The explanations they offer mix natural causes with supernatural suspicions in ways that feel perfectly logical to people whose world is full of forces they cannot fully understand or control. This is a world where the line between natural and supernatural is not clearly drawn, where illness can be caused by bad air or evil eye, where misfortune requires explanation and someone to blame. Soon, very soon, whispers will harden into accusations, suspicions into certainties, and fear will find a name: witch. The concept of witch did not appear suddenly in European consciousness. Picture instead how the idea evolved gradually, shaped by ancient beliefs, religious doctrine, and social anxieties. Long before the great witch hunts, people believed in magic, both beneficial and harmful. Picture the folk traditions where certain people possess special knowledge or power. The cunning folk who could find lost objects, the wise women who knew healing herbs, the charmers who could cure warts with spoken words, all occupied a space between everyday reality and something more mysterious. These practitioners were generally accepted, even valued. Picture a farmer seeking help when his animals fell ill, a mother asking for a charm to protect her children, a young woman wanting a love potion. Magic was simply another tool for managing life's uncertainties, but alongside belief in beneficial magic existed belief in its darker counterpart. Picture the understanding that if some could use supernatural means to heal, others might use similar powers to harm. If a charm could protect, another could curse. The word witch itself carries ancient roots, deriving from Old English terms suggesting knowledge of hidden things. Picture how this word gradually darkened in meaning, how it came to be associated primarily with harmful magic, with people who made pacts with evil forces, who worked their will through powers that came not from God but from darker sources. What changed everything was when religious authorities transformed folk beliefs about magic into a comprehensive theory of demonic conspiracy. Picture learned men in monastery libraries, constructing elaborate frameworks to explain how witchcraft worked and why it posed grave danger. These scholars argued that witchcraft was not merely harmful magic, but evidence of organised devil worship, of a vast conspiracy of witches who had renounced their Christian faith and made pacts with Satan. Picture this theory spreading through books and sermons, transforming simple folk beliefs into apocalyptic threat. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1486 represented a crucial moment. Picture this influential text providing detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches. The book claimed that witches were real, numerous, and extraordinarily dangerous, capable of causing storms, destroying crops, spreading disease, even flying through the air to attend nocturnal gatherings. This theory provided explanations for every kind of misfortune, drought, plague, stillbirths, spoiled milk, lightning strikes, all could be attributed to witchcraft. Picture how any unusual event, any troubling occurrence could be reinterpreted as evidence of malevolent magic. But intellectual theories alone cannot explain the witch hunts that would claim tens of thousands of lives. Picture the social conditions that made these theories seem plausible to ordinary people living in extraordinary times of stress. This was an era of tremendous upheaval. Picture the Protestant Reformation shattering religious unity, creating deep anxieties about salvation. Picture religious wars forcing neighbours to see each other as dangerous heretics. Picture the profound uncertainty this created. If you could no longer be sure who was truly Christian, how could you feel safe? Picture also the Little Ice Age, cooling climate that brought crop failures and famines. Harvests failed with alarming frequency. Winters grew longer and harsher. People watched their children go hungry. Their communities struggled to survive. Such suffering demanded explanation, and witchcraft provided one that made terrible sense. Disease swept through communities with terrifying regularity. Picture villages where plague could kill half the population within weeks. In the absence of germ theory or modern medicine, supernatural explanations filled the void. Certain patterns emerged in who got accused. Picture an elderly woman living alone at the village edge, perhaps a widow who supports herself through healing or fortune-telling. She is poor, marginal, perhaps known for a sharp tongue. When a neighbour's child falls ill after the old woman muttered something in passing, when milk spoils after she was seen near the dairy, suspicion grows. Picture also how social tensions found expression through witchcraft accusations. The neighbour you resented over a property dispute, the woman who seemed too independent, the healer whose remedies sometimes failed, the beggar turned away from your door who cursed as she left, all could become targets when fear needed a face. Women, particularly older, poor or unmarried women, bore the brunt of accusations for complex reasons we will explore. Picture the intersection of misogyny, economic vulnerability, and social marginality that made certain women particularly vulnerable to suspicion. Once accusation was made, legal systems turned their full attention to witchcraft. Picture courts where normal rules of evidence were suspended, where torture was permitted to extract confessions, where conviction seemed almost inevitable. The logic of witch trials contained terrible circularity. Picture the reasoning. If the accused confessed under torture, this proved guilt. If she maintained innocence despite torture, this showed the devil was protecting her, also proving guilt. There was often no path to acquittal. Picture also how one accusation could cascade into many. Under torture, the accused might name accomplices, sometimes in genuine belief, sometimes in desperate hope that confession would stop the pain. Each new name could trigger new arrests, creating witch panics that consumed entire communities. What began as whispered suspicions could transform with terrifying speed into community-wide panic. Picture the psychological dynamics of fear feeding on itself, one accusation making others seem more plausible, each conviction reinforcing belief in conspiracy, every misfortune providing apparent confirmation that witches were everywhere. Picture villages where neighbour turned against neighbour, where friendships dissolved in mutual suspicion, where children testified against parents. Picture how the whisper of fear became a roar that could drown out reason, compassion, and the ordinary bonds of human community. This is the world we will explore together, not to horrify, but to understand. How did educated people come to believe in flying witches? Why were certain individuals targeted while others remained safe? What were the witch hunts like for those caught up in them? We will walk gently through this dark period, bearing witness while seeking understanding of how ordinary human psychology, combined with specific historical circumstances, could produce such extraordinary cruelty. The story of witch hunts is ultimately about fear, how it spreads, how it distorts perception, how it can transform neighbours into monsters and justice into persecution. Before witches were feared, they were trusted. In quiet villages surrounded by forests and fields, there lived women who understood the earth. They knew which roots could soothe pain, which flowers could ease childbirth, and which leaves could heal wounds. They weren't called witches then. They were midwives, herbalists, and wise women, pillars of their communities. When a child was sick, when a harvest failed, or when a mother struggled in labour, it was to these women that people turned. Their knowledge was ancient, passed down through whispers, through trial and error, through stories told by firelight. Some believed their skills were gifts from nature. Others believed they were blessed by unseen spirits of the land. They gathered herbs by the light of the moon, not for magic but for medicine. Lavender for calm, willow bark for pain, chamomile for rest. Each plant had a purpose, and each ritual a rhythm, the rhythm of survival. But their understanding of nature also gave them power, a quiet, feminine power that didn't belong to the church or the crown, and that would one day become dangerous. Because in a world growing more fearful of what it could not explain, knowledge itself would soon become a sin. Long before the word witch ever carried fear, the world was full of wonder. People saw magic in everything, in the wind that bent the trees, in the river that gave life to the fields, in the moon that watched over the night. To live was to depend on the earth, and to respect it. The healers of old understood this balance better than anyone. They believed that every illness, every storm, every birth and death had meaning within nature's rhythm. To heal the body, one had to honour the spirit. When they mixed herbs, they whispered blessings. When they gathered roots, they left offerings, a coin, a prayer, a drop of wine. Not out of superstition, but gratitude. In the quiet of the forest, they found what others could not: peace in solitude and wisdom in the natural world. They learned from the earth's patterns, how plants grew stronger after storms, how decay fed new life, and so their remedies carried both science and soul. But this harmony between human and nature frightened those who sought control. As kingdoms rose and faiths hardened, the gentle language of the natural world began to sound like rebellion. The old songs faded, The rituals were forbidden, and slowly the word magic changed from something sacred to something feared. At first it began with whispers, a sick child who didn't recover, a storm that came too soon, a harvest that failed. And when people looked for someone to blame, their eyes turned toward the women who had always stood between them and the unknown. For centuries, healers had worked with nature's rhythms, herbs, seasons, stars. But now, faith had changed. The new world no longer saw spirits in the trees or gods in the rivers. It saw danger in anything that didn't come from the church. The same herbs that once healed were now seen as tools of the devil. The same prayers once whispered for protection were now cursed as spells. And so, the wise women grew quiet. They stopped gathering herbs beneath the moon. They burned their notes, hid their charms, and whispered their knowledge only in secret. Still, the fear grew, a fever that spread across villages and towns, not of sickness, but of suspicion. Neighbours accused neighbours, priests warned their flocks, and what began as a rumour became law. Because when fear meets power, it always finds a name to burn. And soon, that name was witch. The first trials began quietly. A woman accused of cursing a cow, another blamed for a sudden illness. Each story different, but all born from the same seed, fear. By the late Middle Ages, that fear had become a weapon. In small villages and great cities alike, it spread like wildfire. The church preached of unseen evils. Pamphlets and sermons warned of women who danced with demons, who flew through the night, who whispered to spirits in the dark. But most of those accused were not witches at all. They were the poor, the widowed, the lonely, those who lived on the edges of society, those who were simply different. Once the first accusation was made, the end was almost certain. Confessions came under pain, under torture, under the desperate hope that admitting guilt might mean mercy. Few were ever spared. In towns across Europe, Germany, Scotland, France, England, the fires burned for years. Some historians say as many as 50,000 souls were condemned, and for every name recorded there were others forgotten. Mothers, daughters, healers, all lost to fear disguised as faith. The forests that once sheltered them grew silent. The moonlit fields where herbs once swayed became empty. The age of healing was gone. The age of fire had begun. Once the flames were lit, they became impossible to put out. What began as superstition soon turned into bureaucracy. There were now rules, records, and laws, a machinery built for fear. Across Europe, new manuals appeared. The most infamous of them all was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Published in 1487, it claimed to expose the secrets of witchcraft and instructed how to identify, question, and punish those accused. Its authors called themselves servants of God, but their words turned neighbours into spies and suspicion into certainty. A crooked smile became evidence of evil. A birthmark was called the devil's mark. Even a kind word spoken to a stray cat could be twisted into proof of pacts with dark forces. And so the trials became a ritual of fear, accusations, interrogations, confessions, executions. Every fire burned brighter than the last, until even the judges began to fear the very system they upheld. Somewhere, far from the crowds, the forests remained silent. The rivers still flowed, and the herbs still grew untouched, unseen, waiting for the world to remember what it had forgotten. Centuries passed. The fires that once burned so bright began to dim. The world was changing slowly, painfully. In the age of reason, people began to question what they had once feared. Scholars studied the stars not as omens but as systems of light. Doctors began to see illness as something of the body, not the soul. And with knowledge came silence, the same silence that once filled the forests, now returning to the minds of men. The witch trials faded, one decree at a time. By the 18th century, the last official executions had ended in most of Europe, but their echoes remained. The stories of witches, once real women, began to drift into legend, into folklore. The healer became the hag. The wise woman became a warning in children's tales. And somewhere between truth and fear, history forgot who they truly were. Yet even as centuries passed, something of them endured. The smell of herbs in spring, the whisper of wind through old forests, the quiet wisdom carried by women who still knew the ways of the earth. They could not be erased, only transformed. The witch became a symbol again, not of evil, but of survival. You've seen witches on TV, the cackling laugh, the broomstick, the pointed hat. But that image was born from fear, not truth. The real witches weren't evil sorcerers, they were midwives, healers, and wise women. People who understood the earth, the stars, and the human body long before anyone else dared to. They weren't casting spells of destruction, they were easing pain, saving lives, and preserving knowledge in secret when the world refused to listen. So tonight, when you think of witches, remember them not as villains, but as forgotten guardians of wisdom. Good night, and may the old magic rest easy.